the IIP has started a series of interviews with experts from the EU neighborhood countries on how they cope with the COVID-19 pandemics and what foreign policy consequences this has. You can find them all on our YouTube channel as well as on our website, iipvienna.com. We have already talked about the Western Balkans, and now we're moving to Eastern Europe with Artyom Shraibman from Belarus with us here today. Artyom, thank you very much for being here with us. Can you briefly describe the situation in Belarus? What is happening there? How many cases are there? How is the authorities responding to the situation?
Well, as we speak, the number of tracked cases, number of officially confirmed cases approaches 5,000, and the number of deaths exceeds 40. However, there is little doubt that not just the infected are effectively tracked. Of course, this is the worldwide phenomenon. But also in Belarus, there is a great suspicion that not all the pneumonia patients were properly and timely tested for COVID-19, and some of them were sent home with pneumonia or treated for pneumonia and then successfully treated, or some people died before first COVID-19 confirmed cases, and there was the pneumonia was the official reason of their death, the official cause of their death. So we do not know for sure the numbers, but the overall, let's say, scale is clear from the pace how the things change. And in Belarus, it of course accelerates. We are now in the stages where the pandemic just unfolds. And we've already exceeded the number of tracked or confirmed cases in Ukraine, but considering the fourfold difference in population. Therefore, you can judge only based on this figure the severity of the problem in the country.
So the numbers are probably even higher than they are reported, and you are saying it's mainly because the testing maybe is not done to everyone, or maybe there are some other official reasons why a person gets pneumonia or other disease, why they die also. But I wanted also to ask you whether the problem is only in the fact that there is not enough testing, or there is also some sort of reasons why the government would conceal the official data that they already have. Can we trust sort of the goodwill of the authorities that they're reporting really the numbers that they know?
We of course cannot trust authorities just because Belarus is an authoritarian country and the authorities are let's say incentivized to minimize the scale of situation. However, I do not suspect them currently of gross falsifications or manipulations with data, simply because if there were, let's say, hundreds of unaccounted corpses, or thousands and thousands or tens of thousands of pneumonias being treated in hospitals but not reported, it would become public. Because when the first spike happened in Vitebsk, in city of Vitebsk, just in the course of a couple of days, the relatives of people who were hospitalized immediately contacted the media. Not every one of them, but if you have 100 patients, even if 20% of their relatives communicate with the media, it's already enough to understand the scale of the spike in the number of infected cases. And therefore, Belarus is not China, is not North Korea, not Turkmenistan. Information flows relatively openly online, and that is why I do not suspect that the authorities currently conceal the true massive, horrible volumes of this pandemic. This, I think, is not yet the case.
Yeah, so it's also not like Iran, where
Sure. Belarus is much more open society with a more vibrant, independent media, and the moment the authorities would start doing this, we would learn about it in a couple of days.
All right. So in this case, what is the societal reaction with all the independent media still being open and available to people? How do they perceive the situation? Also on social
It's,
media.
it's of course very hard to definitively say because we don't have many polls. The only poll we had on this issue was done in the late March before the first COVID-19 death. And that poll demonstrated that the majority of the public, up to 70% on certain items, were against, or rather were for more active, more assertive measures on governmental behalf, like remote work, remote study, canceling all the mass events, mass gatherings, which government has not done since then and didn't do it those days. I can only imagine that these 50+% figures have only grown since then after the pandemic took course in Belarus, because at those days when the poll was taken, it was just like tens of cases and zero death. So we can basically extrapolate this and imagine that now people are even for more proactive measures because they see what happened in the world and they see that Belarus is basically the only country where government or the president took a very peculiar course of not necessarily ignoring the crisis completely, but minimizing the threat and rather combating the psychosis, as he calls it, or infodemic, or basically the panic around the virus. He treats it as something that is more dangerous than the virus itself. And everybody sees that every neighbor of Belarus took another course of actions. And so people, of course, as we've seen, as I've said to you, based on this poll, are for more proactive measures, but we do not know how did it impact the attitude to government, let's say, attitude to president. We can only imagine that they decreased, but the polls are not there. Based on very anecdotal evidence, me and many of my colleagues and friends report that many previously apolitical, apathetic people towards politics are becoming increasingly angry. It's just judging on my relatives and friends, are becoming increasingly angry with how the government treats things. And the amount of, let's say, anti-Lukashenko hate online has palpably increased. I mean, it's just something that is overwhelming in Facebook or on Twitter and so on and so forth. But again, this is just anecdotal evidence.
Sure. So why is the response been so slow? And does it maybe have to do anything with the presidential elections that are coming already in August this year? And also what comes to my mind immediately is the economic situation in the country, which even before this pandemic was quite strained. So how
Precisely.
would you? Yeah.
I think you hit the nail on the head with the last point, because I would say that the economic is the key driver of the reaction of the government, because Belarus doesn't have these opportunities for stimulus packages, for universal basic incomes or things like this, cover some support mechanisms to cover the losses of the businesses or of the people, like many other countries did with lockdowns. So this was from the start not an option for Lukashenko, because he thought, and I would say in this case reasonably thought, that the lockdown would kill Belarusian economy, which was in a very dire shape even before the pandemic. However, there is also a personal element to this. Lukashenko is, let's say, sincere believer in that this pandemic can be easily overcome like the previous pandemics, and that the panic around the virus spread can be more dangerous than the virus. He refers to it as psychosis, as I've said, and he refers to this whole situation as corona psychosis, and he does it so frequently that this is really something that is deep into his conscience. He does honestly, sincerely believes that the problem is overblown. He constantly quotes the statistics, refers to the statistics, which shows that the number of pneumonias and deaths from pneumonias this year in Belarus.
Can you hear me now? Yeah.
Yes, I can.
Yeah. All right. So you finished with that. He sincerely believes in the fact that it can be overcome, and that the deaths of pneumonia every year more or less.
Yeah, he constantly refers to the figures that the deaths of pneumonia, for example, have decreased since the last year. And so he tries to, and he even for his personal, attitude, he tries to minimize it, not just necessarily for the public eye, but for himself. He tries to convince himself that it's not such a big deal that would warrant more assertive measures on behalf of the state. He already ordered to end the extended school holidays, so he now sends the kids back to schools basically from the next week, I believe. So it means that this is partly economic and partly personal. You cannot actually separate which is more important. They are just self-fulfilling. Because of the economy, he just does not actually think towards the idea of total lockdown or total quarantine.
Right. So how does it play into the fact that there are presidential elections upcoming? What does it change for the president? What does it change for the opposition parties or any campaigning, anything?
Well, there are two questions in one. On the opposition, of course, it severely limits the opportunities, the possibilities basically for protesting. Street protesting is basically now off the table because many oppositional groups view this campaign as an opportunity to rally their supporters for street activity. And now it's out of the picture, at least for several months ahead. The public attention was diverted from the oppositional activities to the COVID-19 developments. So this also that doesn't actually play into their hands. On the other hand, what we've described before, this public dissatisfaction or even I would say irritation with how government responds to coronavirus, it actually might play of course against the trust to Lukashenko, against his support rate, which means it will partly play into the hands of his opponents. I mean, this is not rocket science, of course, but in this case, opposition will probably build the entire campaigns that they will run this way or the other on the fact that government mishandled this, mismanaged the situation, and the president is personally responsible for it. So they will probably reference Chernobyl a lot, Chernobyl situation, to try to revive this trauma that sits in the conscience of many Belarusians. On the Lukashenko presidential, side of it, this is of course one of the severest challenges he experienced on the eve of presidential elections. It doesn't mean directly that his system of elections control will fail him. It does not mean this. However, it will be, if this pandemic spirals out of control, if the economic situation deteriorates even further, it would be for him and for his system, vertical of power as he calls it, it would be really hard to convince all the local officials who actually run the elections and the electoral procedures that they should be as obedient as they have always been. So he will struggle to do this. I'm not saying that he will fail in this and his system will fail in this, but this will be now not a free run as it was all the years before that. And also it would be really hard to mobilize people to vote for him because he still needs people to come to the voting booth, at least to show turnout. And turnout is something that the government is always obsessed with inflating. And so I imagine that now the turnout inflation efforts will be even more significant.
So in this, with all these difficulties that you mentioned, do you see any potential, any scenario in which some sort of a political change or change of the regime at all could happen in Belarus?
Well, of course, it looks like this perfect storm, black swan kind of situation, which usually dumps this kind of regimes. Or when these regimes fall, they usually fall because of this kind of unpredictable, events like this pandemic and crisis that it inflicted on. But you never know which particular crisis will trigger the regime change, and therefore, nobody knows for sure, of course. But if these trends that we now see continue and they're not stopped in any way. For example, if he continues to behave in this very virus dissident way, if the corpses will pile up, to be very black and cynical on this, to be very dark and cynical on this, if the economy, despite his efforts to save it, if economy still collapses, I can imagine people around him thinking about or having a thought, why would we need him anymore? And then from this thought, the changes usually arise this way or another. Nobody knows the exact scenario. What I don't actually believe in is some kind of revolutionary, uprising scenario for Belarus, of course, because the regime or its enforcement agencies are still strong enough, I believe, to suppress any meaningful street activity, especially since the street activity will be hard to organize during the pandemic, of course. So if the threat is somewhere there, it is within the nomenclature. It's not in the public unrest. But again, nobody knows the limits of fragility of the system, or rather the limit of its flexibility. I can imagine that seeing that he is losing the controls that he had, he will modify his policies. He is still very much a political beast that feels the change in the air. And if he smells that the officials are not as loyal as they were before, I imagine him immediately changing the course towards those action that will enable more loyalty.
All right. So it sounds like also one of the main factors is actually the economic success, or at least not a complete failure of the system in this situation. So then the question goes, how do external actors play in that? So Belarus is known for being, for taking loans from both sides, so to say, from the EU side, from Russia, also more recently, relatively recently, from China, where do all these actors stand today, while they also have to cope with their own internal situations with the crisis and also finance the response inside of the countries? How do they see Belarus in this new environment?
Well, with Russia, it's very complicated because from the last year, Russia basically was refusing to issue any new loans and credits to Belarus, and so this pandemic did not add any enthusiasm to Russian decision makers in this regard. So the credit cooperation between Russia and Belarus has basically been frozen, and Belarus just is now returning the debts. That's it. It cannot properly rely on any new credits, and that's why the Belarusian government has not even applied for any new Russian loans. It only applied for new EU, World Bank, IMF assistance, but not from the Russia, which is very peculiar, feature of our times. Then with China, I imagine that there will be more opportunities because China has the chances to come out of this crisis as the first, let's say, survivor. And so, relatively speaking, its economy will probably be in the better shape sooner, and therefore it will be open for more cooperation, including financial cooperation with its friends like Belarus, because the relations between Belarus and China are really quite, positive. And then with the EU, the volumes of the support might not be very significant with the Brussels, but some of the European banks, like European Investment Bank and EBRD, can actually enhance their support for Belarus or loans for Belarus. And the recent news that I've seen indicate that Belarus has applied for up to €1 billion of EBRD support, or rather loans. And then Belarus also applied for $900 million IMF funding. So we'll see where it goes, but obviously Belarus is looking into options because the economy not just stagnates, it now in the full-on recession. in the debt service and problem is probably one of the key problems for Belarus in the coming years. We have too many debts and too few resources to cover them. So government will have to rely on foreign funding and foreign debt again to basically cover the not just the losses from the pandemic and from this crisis, but also to repay the previous loans that it took.
So maybe one last question regarding Belarus-Russian relations. There have been some sort of re-emerging, lines of saying that Belarus might lose its sovereignty, or sort of second Ukraine scenario could happen to the country. Under which circumstances do you see it happening, or if at all?
Well, of course, I mean, any Russian neighbor cannot afford being in total, political turmoil, because if you get into this mayhem situation where you just torn apart as a country, Russia will come. And this is the rule. And this has been the rule with Georgia, with Ukraine. It has been consistently the rule with Moldova. So Belarus cannot afford slipping into this kind of total state collapse. But unless this happens, I do not foresee any significant, attempts on Russian part to destabilize the situation further. Because, to be honest, Russia faces also severe domestic problems, economically, epidemiologically, you name it. And from what we see, the attention has been entirely diverted from foreign policy to domestic policy in Russia. Even this so-called deeper integration project that was under huge international spotlight last year has now folded, basically, because nobody now pays attention to this integration roadmaps which were under negotiations, simply because nobody needs them anymore. Putin has chosen the path for his, transfer of power or lack thereof, but he does not need Belarus for this anymore, and there is just no appetite in Russia to engage into some new very costly geopolitical adventures, which will only destabilize the situation further. And in Belarus, you don't see any willingness in response to this crisis, to join Russia, to integrate closer with Russia. What we see is rather opposite process. We see the complete disintegration on all the fronts. The sides have not been able to come up with joint response to this pandemic, and rather they basically reinstalled the border that has never existed. I think since the 18th century, there has not been a border between Belarus and Russia. And now they've reinstated it, albeit temporarily, but still. They've limited movement. There have not been, as I've said, any financial assistance. When Russians sent just 10,000 of these testing kits systems on this COVID-19, Belarusian officials basically went out of their way to say that these tests were flawed, that we do not ask for anything more, that all the rest of the test kits will only be purchased on commercial basis, so we don't need any Russian help. You see the crisis in relations, not any, prelude to reunion.
Okay, all right. Well, thank you very much for all your responses. Take care, stay healthy, and hope to see you soon, also in person.